Have you ever been somewhere you felt like you didn't quite belong? Caught between two worlds that both claimed you, but neither fully accepted you? Maybe you're from a mixed background yourself. Or maybe you've just felt that ache of being different in a place that demands conformity. If you are, drop your state in the comments because today's story is about a woman who turned that painful difference into her greatest strength, though she never could have imagined the dangerous path that would take her there. The fluorescent lights of the Seoul office building hummed overhead as Mia Chun gathered the last of her marketing proposals from her desk, their harsh glare reflecting off the glass surfaces that dominated the 32nd floor. At 24, she had worked tirelessly to establish herself in one of Korea's most competitive advertising firms. But after 18 months, she still felt like an outsider looking in through windows that would never quite open for her. The whispers had followed her since her first day. They thought she couldn't understand when they spoke in rapid Korean about the girl with the blue eyes. The one who looked Korean but wasn't quite Korean enough. The one who spoke the language but with just enough American accent to mark her as different. Mixed heritage was becoming more common in Seoul, but in the traditional corporate world, Mia Chun stood out like a sapphire in a field of black stones. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and glanced around the empty office. Her colleagues had left hours ago for their evening plans, but Mia stayed late again, hoping that dedication might somehow bridge the gap that genetics and geography had created. Her father was Korean, born in Busan before immigrating to California, where he met her Irish-American mother. Mia had grown up straddling two cultures, fluent in both languages, but never quite native in either world. The proposal she'd spent weeks perfecting lay in neat stacks on her desk, ready for tomorrow's presentation to the Hanwha Group. If she could land this account, maybe the whispers would finally stop. Maybe she would stop being the American girl trying to play Korean businesswoman and simply become Mia Chun, successful marketing executive. Her phone buzzed with a text from her roommate asking about dinner plans, but Mia barely glanced at it. The city lights of Gangnam stretched out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, a glittering maze of ambition and tradition that she was still learning to navigate. Seoul at night was beautiful and intimidating in equal measure, all neon promises and ancient expectations. She shouldered her designer handbag, a recent purchase that had cost her a week's salary but sent the right message about success and belonging. Image mattered in Seoul's corporate world almost as much as results, and Mia had learned to play the game even when it exhausted her. The elevator descended through 32 floors of similar ambition, carrying her toward the underground parking garage where her modest sedan waited among the BMWs and Mercedes that her senior colleagues drove. The parking garage was dimly lit and mostly empty at this hour, her footsteps echoing off concrete walls as she made her way toward her car. She was thinking about the presentation tomorrow, rehearsing her opening lines in her head, when she heard voices coming from the far end of the garage. Male voices, speaking in Korean too rapid and too aggressive for a normal business conversation. Mia slowed her pace, instinct warning her that something was wrong. The voices grew louder, angrier, and she caught fragments of words that made her blood run cold. Territory, debt, family. She pressed herself against a concrete pillar, heart racing as she realized she was witnessing something far more dangerous than a business disagreement. 3 men in expensive suits stood near a black sedan, but these weren't ordinary businessmen. There was something predatory about their posture, something cold in their voices that spoke of violence held barely in check. One of them, tall with slicked-back hair, was shouting at a younger man who knelt beside the car, blood trickling from his nose. This was gang business, Mia realized with growing terror. She had heard stories about the criminal organizations that operated in Seoul's shadows, but she had never expected to stumble across them in an upscale business district. She needed to leave, needed to get to her car and drive away before they noticed her presence. She took a careful step backward, then another, but her heel caught on a piece of loose concrete and sent a small stone skittering across the garage floor. The sound seemed impossibly loud in the tense silence, and all 4 men turned toward her hiding spot. Run, her mind screamed, but her legs felt frozen as the tall man with slicked hair began walking toward her pillar with predatory grace. She could hear his expensive shoes clicking against concrete, could feel her heart hammering against her ribs as panic flooded her system. She was a witness now, and witnesses to gang violence rarely walked away unharmed. Then she heard another voice, deeper and carrying absolute authority, speaking a single word in Korean that made the approaching man stop dead in his tracks. The voice belonged to someone who was clearly in charge, someone whose commands were not questioned or ignored. Mia held her breath, pressed against the cold concrete, as footsteps approached her hiding place. He appeared around the edge of the pillar like something from a dark fairy tale, tall and broad-shouldered with the kind of presence that made lesser men step aside without thinking. His black hair was styled perfectly despite the late hour, his charcoal suit tailored to emphasize the powerful frame beneath. But it was his eyes that caught her attention and held it, dark and intelligent with an intensity that seemed to see straight through her professional facade to the frightened girl beneath. Jin Woo-bin was 31 years old and had been managing his family's interests in Seoul for 8 years, ever since his father's death had thrust him into a world where weakness meant extinction and mercy was a luxury few could afford. He had expected to spend this evening collecting a debt from Kim's organization, not rescuing a beautiful woman with extraordinary blue eyes from a situation that could get her killed. "You need to come with me," he said in accented English, his voice low and urgent. "Now, before they decide you've seen too much." Mia stared at him, torn between terror and fascination. This man was clearly dangerous, clearly part of whatever criminal business was unfolding in the garage, but something in his eyes told her that he was offering protection rather than threat. The alternative was facing the other men alone, and she had seen enough in their faces to know that would not end well for her. She nodded, not trusting her voice, and he extended his hand to her with surprising gentleness. His fingers were warm and strong as they closed around hers, and she felt an unexpected jolt of electricity at the contact. This was insane, following a stranger into darkness, but every instinct told her that this particular stranger was her only chance of getting out of the garage alive. He led her quickly but quietly toward a different section of the parking garage, where a sleek black car waited with 2 other men standing guard. These men looked like soldiers, alert and dangerous, but they stepped aside respectfully as their leader approached with his unexpected companion. "Get in," he told her, opening the passenger door of what she now realized was an extremely expensive sedan. "We need to leave before Kim's people decide to make this complicated." Mia hesitated for only a moment before sliding into leather seats that probably cost more than her monthly rent. The car smelled like expensive cologne and subtle danger, like power wrapped in civility. As they pulled out of the garage, she caught a glimpse of the original confrontation through the rear window. The men who had been ready to hunt her down were now bowing respectfully to someone she couldn't see, their earlier aggression replaced by careful deference. "You're safe now," the man beside her said, and something in his voice made her believe it despite the impossibility of the situation. "I'm Jin Woo-bin." She turned to study his profile as he drove through Seoul's neon-lit streets with casual confidence. His features were sharply defined, aristocratic in a way that spoke of good breeding and better education. This was not some street thug, but someone who commanded respect in a world where respect was earned through intelligence as much as force. "Mia Chun," she managed to say, her voice steadier than she felt. "Thank you for helping me, but I don't understand what just happened back there." "You witnessed a business disagreement between organizations that prefer to keep their affairs private," Jean replied carefully. "Unfortunately, that makes you a person of interest to some very unforgiving people." The weight of his words settled over her like cold water. She was in danger, real danger, because she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Her carefully ordered life of marketing presentations and corporate politics had just collided with a world she had only glimpsed in movies, and the collision might cost her everything. "What does that mean for me?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Jean glanced at her, and she saw something shift in his expression, something that might have been regret or determination or both. "It means that until this situation is resolved, you'll need protection." "My protection?" As they drove through the glittering maze of Seoul at night, Mia realized that her life had just taken a turn that no amount of corporate training could have prepared her for. She was now under the protection of a man who clearly wielded considerable power in Seoul's criminal underworld, a man whose dark eyes promised safety and danger in equal measure. The girl who had spent months trying to fit into Seoul's business world had just been thrust into a completely different realm, one where her mixed heritage and blue eyes might be the least of her worries. But as she stole another glance at Jean Wubin's profile, she found herself wondering if maybe, for the first time since arriving in Seoul, she had finally met someone who saw her difference as something other than a flaw to be overlooked. Mia woke to sunlight streaming through her apartment windows and the disorienting feeling that the previous night had been an elaborate dream. For a moment she lay still, staring at her familiar ceiling, trying to convince herself that she had not actually been rescued from a gang confrontation by a devastatingly handsome stranger who looked like he stepped out of a noir film. But the business card on her nightstand told a different story. Elegant black cardstock with Jean Wubin's name embossed in silver Korean characters. She had barely finished her morning coffee when a firm knock echoed through her small apartment. Through the peephole, she saw Jean standing in her hallway wearing a different perfectly tailored suit, this one charcoal gray that emphasized his broad shoulders. He looked completely at ease in her modest building, as if expensive cars and armed escorts were normal features of residential neighborhoods. "We need to talk," he said when she opened the door, his expression serious. "May I come in?" Mia stepped aside, acutely aware of how small her studio apartment must seem to someone who clearly lived in a different economic stratosphere. Her furniture was clean and carefully chosen, but obviously budget-conscious. Her decorating style caught between Korean minimalism and American comfort in a way that never quite resolved itself. Jean moved through her space with the same quiet confidence he had shown the night before, taking in details without seeming to judge. He paused at the small bookshelf where Korean literature sat alongside English novels, where family photos showed her parents at their wedding and her grandmother in traditional hanbok. "You're in more danger than I initially thought," he said, turning to face her with an expression that made her stomach drop. "Kim's organization has been asking questions about you. They know you work at Sterling Communications, they know where you live, and they're watching your building." The words hit her like cold water, washing away any hope that she could simply return to her normal life and pretend the previous night had never happened. She sank onto her small couch, legs suddenly unsteady as the reality of her situation crystallized. "What do they want from me?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would not be reassuring. "To ensure your silence, permanently if necessary." Jin's voice was matter-of-fact, but she caught something else underneath, something that might have been anger on her behalf. "These men don't take chances with witnesses, especially ones who can identify them to authorities." Mia wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly cold despite the warm morning sun flooding through her windows. Her carefully planned life was crumbling around her, months of building professional credibility and personal stability reduced to nothing by a chance encounter in a parking garage. "I can protect you," Jean continued, his voice gentler now. "But it means leaving this apartment, leaving your routine, until we can resolve this situation permanently." She looked up at him, this stranger who was offering to upend his own life to keep her safe. There was something in his dark eyes that made her believe he meant what he said, but accepting his protection meant stepping fully into his world, a world she knew nothing about except that it was dangerous and probably illegal. A soft buzzing from his phone interrupted her thoughts, and Jean answered with a crisp word in Korean. The conversation was brief but intense, and when he ended the call, his expression had hardened. "We need to leave now," he said, moving toward her window to peer carefully through the blinds. "There are 2 men in a car across the street who weren't there when I arrived. Pack only what you need for a few days." The urgency in his voice galvanized her into action. She threw clothes and toiletries into a weekend bag with shaking hands, her mind struggling to process that she was essentially fleeing her own life. When she hesitated at her laptop, Jean appeared beside her. "Bring it," he said. "You might need to contact your office, and we'll want everything to appear normal from the outside." 20 minutes later, she was sitting in the passenger seat of Jin's sedan again, watching her neighborhood disappear behind them as they drove toward an unknown future. The men he had spotted were following at a discreet distance, and she could see Jean monitoring them in his mirrors with professional calm. The building they eventually pulled into was everything her modest apartment was not. Glass and steel reaching toward the sky, doormen in expensive uniforms, the kind of lobby that whispered money and power and exclusivity. Jin's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors, accessible only by private elevator that required both a key card and biometric scan. The space that greeted her was stunning. All clean lines and expensive art, floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of Seoul's sprawl. But it was clearly a home, not just a showcase, with comfortable furniture and personal touches that spoke of someone who actually lived here rather than merely using it for display. "This is beautiful," she said, moving toward the windows where the city stretched out below like a living map of ambition and possibility. "Thank you." Jean watched her explore his space with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You'll be safe here. My security is comprehensive, and very few people know about this residence." A soft chime announced the arrival of the private elevator, and Jean tensed slightly before relaxing as a tall man in his 40s emerged. This newcomer had the same air of controlled danger as Jean, but tempered with obvious loyalty and respect. "Kong Miho," Jean said by way of introduction. "My most trusted associate." "Kong, this is Mia Chun." The older man studied her with intelligent eyes, taking in her composed posture despite the circumstances. "Miss Chun," he said with a slight bow. "It's a pleasure to meet you, though I wish it were under better circumstances." There was genuine respect in his tone, not the dismissive politeness she had expected. Whatever Jean had told him about her, it had earned her consideration rather than mere tolerance. "Have you eaten?" Jean asked her, and she realized she had been too nervous for breakfast. "Let me show you the kitchen." The kitchen was a chef's dream, all professional-grade appliances and marble countertops, but Jean moved through it with easy familiarity. He began preparing what looked like traditional Korean breakfast with an efficiency that suggested this was routine rather than performance. "You cook," she observed, settling onto one of the bar stools to watch him work. "My mother insisted I learn before she would allow me to live independently. She said a man who couldn't feed himself properly had no business leading others." There was affection in his voice when he mentioned his mother, a softness that made him seem more human and less like the intimidating figure who had rescued her. As he cooked, he told her about taking over his family's business at 23 when his father died unexpectedly. The weight of responsibility, the steep learning curve, the loneliness of making decisions that affected dozens of families who depended on his organization for their livelihood. "It's not what people imagine," he said, plating rice and perfectly seasoned vegetables with careful attention to presentation. "The movies make it seem glamorous, but mostly it's about maintaining balance. Protecting our people, honoring agreements, ensuring everyone prospers within their proper sphere." Mia found herself drawn into conversation more naturally than she had expected, sharing her own struggles with identity and belonging in a city that felt familiar yet foreign. He listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions about her experience growing up between cultures, her decision to come to Seoul, her hopes for building a career that honored both sides of her heritage. "You said last night that you felt like an outsider," he said as they finished eating. "But outsiders often see things more clearly than those who've never questioned their place in the world." The way he looked at her when he said it made something flutter in her chest, a awareness that had nothing to do with danger and everything to do with the fascinating man sitting across from her. This was insane, being attracted to someone whose world operated by rules she didn't understand, but there was something in Jin's dark eyes that made her forget about sanity. They were still talking when Kong appeared in the doorway with an expression that made Jin immediately alert. "We have movement," he said quietly. "Kim's people are testing our perimeter security." Jin stood with fluid grace, his demeanor shifting from companion to commander in the space of a heartbeat. "Stay away from the windows," he told Mia, his voice carrying absolute authority. "I'll handle this." But as he moved toward the door, Mia caught his arm without thinking. "Be careful," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. He paused, looking down at her with an expression that made her breath catch. Something passed between them in that moment, an acknowledgement of connection that had nothing to do with protection and everything to do with the spark that had been building since their first meeting. "Always," he said softly. Then he was gone with Kong, leaving her alone in his beautiful, secure fortress to wonder when the dangerous stranger who had rescued her had started to feel like someone she couldn't bear to lose. The next morning brought Seoul wrapped in gray clouds that matched Mia's restless mood. She had slept poorly in Jin's guest room, her dreams filled with shadowy figures and the constant awareness that her life had been completely derailed by circumstances beyond her control. She found Jean in his study, speaking quietly in Korean to someone on the phone, his expression grim as he gestured toward documents spread across his mahogany desk. When he ended the call, he looked up at her with eyes that held exhaustion and something else, something that might have been regret. "The Kim organization is being more aggressive than expected," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "We may need to adjust our timeline for resolving this situation." Mia settled into the leather chair across from his desk, wrapping her silk robe more tightly around herself. She had borrowed it from his guest bathroom, and it smelled faintly of his cologne, a scent that was becoming dangerously familiar. What does that mean exactly? It means they're not content to simply watch and wait. They're actively hunting for you, which suggests they view you as a more significant threat than a random witness should represent. The weight of his words pressed down on her like a physical force. She had spent her entire life trying to fit in, trying to be unremarkable enough to avoid unwanted attention, and now she was the target of professional criminals who wanted her silenced permanently. "I keep thinking this is all some kind of mistake," she said, her voice smaller than she intended. "I'm nobody special. I work in marketing. I pay my taxes. I've never even gotten a speeding ticket. How did my life become so complicated?" Jean leaned back in his chair, studying her with an intensity that made her skin warm. "You're wrong about being nobody special," he said quietly. "From the moment I saw you in that garage, I knew you were different. The way you held yourself together despite being terrified, the way you trusted me even though you had no reason to believe I wasn't just as dangerous as the others." His words stirred something deep in her chest, a longing she had carried for years without fully acknowledging it. All her life, she had felt caught between worlds, too Korean for her American classmates and too American for traditional Korean society. Her blue eyes marked her as different wherever she went, a visible reminder that she didn't quite belong anywhere completely. Growing up was hard, she found herself saying, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "In California, kids called me exotic or asked where I was really from. When I came to Seoul, people stared at my eyes like they were trying to solve a puzzle. My Korean is fluent, but there's still something in my accent that marks me as foreign. I thought if I worked hard enough, achieved enough, maybe I could earn a place somewhere." Jean rose from his desk and moved to the window, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the gray morning light. "I understand more than you might think," he said, his voice carrying a weight that suggested deep personal experience. "When my father died, I was 23 and completely unprepared to lead our organization. The older men questioned whether someone so young could command respect, whether I had the strength to make the hard decisions that keep our people safe and our business profitable." Mia watched him as he spoke, noting the way his hands clasped behind his back with military precision, the careful control in his posture that spoke of years learning to project authority he didn't always feel. "Every day I wake up carrying the weight of 50 families who depend on our organization for their livelihood," he continued. "Every decision I make affects their children's education, their parents' medical care, their futures. The loneliness of that responsibility is something I wouldn't wish on anyone." She stood and moved toward him, drawn by something vulnerable in his voice that called to the part of her that understood isolation. When she placed her hand gently on his arm, he turned to look at her with surprise that quickly deepened into something more complex. "But you've succeeded," she said softly. "Even I can see that you're respected, that people trust your leadership. You've earned your place." "At what cost?" he asked, his dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I've built walls so high that sometimes I forget there's supposed to be something worth protecting on the other side." They were standing close enough that she could see the slight scar along his jawline, could smell the subtle cologne that clung to his perfectly pressed shirt. The air between them felt charged with possibility and danger in equal measure, and she found herself wondering what it would feel like to bridge the distance that separated them. The moment was shattered by the sharp buzz of Jin's security system. He moved to the wall panel with swift efficiency, his expression hardening as he reviewed the camera feeds. "We have a problem," he said, his voice switching to the cold command tone she was beginning to recognize. "3 men in the lobby claiming to be building inspectors, but they're carrying concealed weapons. Fear spiked through Mia's system as the reality of her danger became immediate rather than abstract. These weren't distant threats or theoretical possibilities, but armed men actively hunting for her in Jin's building. Stay in the center of the apartment, away from all windows, Jin instructed as he moved toward what she now realized was a concealed weapons cabinet. Kong is already handling building security, but if they get past the lobby, I need you to follow my instructions exactly. 20 minutes later, Jin's phone rang with an update that made his shoulders relax fractionally. The men had been turned away by building security, their fake credentials exposed, and their retreat monitored by Kang's network. But the message was clear. The Kim organization was willing to take significant risks to reach her. We're leaving, Jin announced, already moving toward the bedroom to pack. They know about this location now, which means it's compromised. I have a safe house outside the city where we can regroup. The drive to the safe house took them through Seoul's outer districts, past traditional neighborhoods where old Korea persisted alongside gleaming modernity. Mia found herself pressed against Jin's side in the back seat while Kong drove, their bodyguard maintaining constant communication with other members of Jin's organization who were monitoring potential threats along their route. When they stopped suddenly at an intersection, Mia looked out to see a black sedan blocking their path. Before she could process what was happening, men emerged from the vehicle with obvious aggressive intent, moving toward their car with coordinated precision. Down, Jin commanded, pushing her toward the floor as he drew a weapon with fluid grace. Stay down no matter what you hear. The next few minutes passed in a blur of shouting voices, screeching tires, and the sharp crack of gunshots. Mia pressed herself against the car floor, heart hammering as she heard Jin coordinating with Kong in rapid Korean, their voices calm and professional despite the chaos surrounding them. When the shooting stopped and the immediate danger passed, she found herself pulled gently upright by Jin's strong hands, his dark eyes scanning her face with urgent concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough with adrenaline and something else that sounded like fear. "I don't think so," she managed to say, but when she tried to sit up properly, she noticed blood on her sleeve from where she had scraped her arm against broken glass during the confrontation. Jin saw the injury at the same moment and immediately shifted into protective mode, his dangerous demeanor softening as he examined the shallow cut with careful fingers. "We need to clean this properly," he said, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands that had just handled a gun with lethal efficiency. At the safe house, a modest but well-secured residence hidden among traditional homes, Jin insisted on tending to her wound personally. He worked with the focused attention of someone who understood that even small injuries required proper care, cleaning the cut with steady hands while she tried not to focus on how close he was sitting beside her. "This might sting," he warned before applying antiseptic, and when she winced, he automatically placed his free hand on her knee in comfort. The touch sent electricity through her system that had nothing to do with pain and everything to do with the man whose protective instincts seemed to extend to her smallest discomfort. "Thank you," she said when he finished bandaging her arm with professional precision. "For everything. I know this is disrupting your life, and you barely know me." Jin looked up from securing the bandage, his hands still resting gently on her arm. "I know enough," he said quietly. "I know you're brave enough to witness something terrible and still trust a stranger to help you. I know you're strong enough to leave everything familiar because it's the smart choice. I know you see people clearly, including parts of me that most people never bother to look for." His words stirred something deep in her chest, a recognition that felt almost like coming home. In his dangerous world, surrounded by luxury she could never afford and protection she had never needed before, she somehow felt more seen and understood than she ever had in her carefully planned corporate life. Later that evening, as they sat together in the safe house's small living room, Jin's phone rang with a call that made him step outside for privacy. Through the window, Mia could see him speaking with obvious respect and formality, and when he returned, his expression held a mixture of anticipation and something that might have been nervousness. "My mother wants to meet you," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "She's heard about the situation and expressed some strong opinions about my responsibilities in the matter." Mia felt a flutter of anxiety mixed with curiosity. Meeting the mother of a man she was growing dangerously attached to seemed like a significant step, especially when that man operated in a world where family approval might carry consequences she couldn't imagine. "What did you tell her about me?" she asked, uncertain whether she wanted to know the answer. "The truth, that you're intelligent, brave, and deserving of protection regardless of the cost." Jin's dark eyes met hers with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. "And that I find myself caring about your safety more than strategic wisdom would recommend." His honesty hit her like a physical force, acknowledgement of feelings she had been trying not to examine too closely. This attraction building between them was dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with criminal organizations and everything to do with how completely he was capturing her attention and affection. "I want to stay," she heard herself saying, the words emerging from some deep part of her that refused to be intimidated by circumstances beyond her control. "Whatever happens with the Kim organization, whatever this situation costs you or your business, I want to see it through. With you." Jean moved toward her with deliberate intent, stopping just close enough that she could see the exact moment when his careful control wavered. "Are you certain?" he asked, his voice low and rough. "Because once you choose this path, there's no returning to your old life unchanged." Mia looked into his dark eyes and saw her future reflected there, dangerous and uncertain, but real in a way that her previous existence had never been. She was tired of being caught between worlds, tired of never quite fitting anywhere completely. Maybe it was time to stop trying to fit into spaces that were never meant for her and start building something new with someone who saw her differences as strengths rather than flaws to overlook. "I'm certain," she said, and when Jean smiled with genuine warmth and relief, she knew she had finally found a place where her blue eyes were seen not as marking her as foreign, but as making her precious enough to protect at any cost. Dawn filtered through the safe house windows, casting soft light across the modest bedroom where Mia had spent another restless night. The events of the previous day felt surreal in the peaceful morning quiet, but the bandage on her arm and the weight of Jin's protection served as constant reminders that her new reality included dangers she was still learning to navigate. She found Jin in the kitchen, already dressed in a fresh suit despite the early hour, speaking quietly into his phone in rapid Korean. When he saw her, he ended the call with a few sharp words and turned to give her his full attention. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his dark eyes scanning her face with the careful assessment that was becoming familiar. "Any pain from yesterday?" "I'm fine," she assured him, touched by his concern but also restless with the feeling of being protected rather than productive. "Jean, I can't just hide here indefinitely while you handle everything. I need to do something, contribute somehow to resolving this situation." His expression shifted to something between admiration and concern. "This isn't your world, Mia. The people we're dealing with don't follow rules you understand, and making the wrong move could cost both of us everything. But it is my world now, isn't it?" she said, moving closer to where he stood against the kitchen counter. "You said last night there's no going back unchanged. If I'm going to be part of this, I want to understand how it works, what drives the decisions you make." Jean studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression as he seemed to recognize her determination. "Very well," he said finally. "But understanding my world means understanding things that might disturb you." He began explaining the intricate web of loyalty and obligation that governed his organization, how families had been bound together for generations by codes of honor that transcended simple business relationships. Every member of their group had sworn oaths that made their commitment more than employment, closer to kinship forged by shared risk and mutual dependence. When my father died, I inherited not just his business interests, but his responsibilities to every person who had trusted him with their livelihood, Jean said as he prepared breakfast with the same careful attention he brought to everything else. "These people aren't just employees. They're family in ways that matter more than blood." Mia watched him work, noting how even simple domestic tasks were performed with precision and grace. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, economical and purposeful, as if every action served a greater design. "Show me," she said impulsively. "Let me help with something. I'm a good cook, and I want to understand the details of your life, not just the broad strokes." Jean paused, then stepped aside with a slight smile that transformed his entire face. "Very well, but we do this properly, with respect for the techniques my mother taught me. For the next hour, They worked together preparing a traditional Korean meal, Jean guiding her hands as she learned to fold mandu with the correct technique, his patient instruction revealing depths of cultural knowledge she had never fully appreciated. His touch was careful and warm as he adjusted her grip on the delicate dumpling wrapper, and she found herself hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. The honor we speak of isn't abstract, he explained as they worked side by side. It's built through countless small actions, through keeping promises even when they become inconvenient, through protecting those who depend on you regardless of personal cost. As he spoke about family loyalty and inherited duty, Mia began to understand that Jin's world operated according to principles that were both ancient and intensely personal. This wasn't simply criminal enterprise, but a complex social system where respect was earned through demonstrated commitment and trust was the foundation of survival. They were setting the table when Jin's phone buzzed with an incoming call. His expression darkened as he listened to rapid Korean delivered in an urgent tone, and Mia watched his face transform from domestic contentment to cold fury in the space of seconds. "What happened?" she asked when he ended the call, though she dreaded the answer. "They took your coworker, the one who saw us together that first night in the building." Jin's voice was flat and deadly, the warmth from their morning together completely erased. "Kim's organization grabbed her outside her apartment 2 hours ago." Terror flooded through Mia's system as she realized that her presence in Jin's life had put an innocent person in danger. Sarah, her cubicle neighbor who had stayed late that night and seen them leave together, was now paying the price for Mia's involvement with forces beyond either of their understanding. "We have to help her," she said immediately, though she had no idea how such a rescue might be accomplished. "She's involved because of me, because she was curious about who I was leaving with. This is my fault." "No," Jean said firmly, his hands settling on her shoulders with gentle strength. "This is Kim's choice to escalate beyond reasonable boundaries. But you're right that we need to respond, and quickly." She could see the calculations running behind his dark eyes, the strategic mind that had kept his organization intact for 8 years evaluating options with cold precision. When he spoke again, his tone carried the authority of absolute command. "The traditional response would be immediate and overwhelming force," he said. "We find their location and eliminate everyone responsible, sending a message that attacking our people carries consequences that extend to their entire organization." The casual way he spoke about violence made something cold settle in Mia's stomach, a reminder that the man she was falling for operated in a world where death was a business tool rather than a last resort. "But there might be another way," she said quickly, grasping for alternatives that wouldn't require bloodshed. "What if we tried negotiating first? Find out what they really want, whether there's a way to resolve this without anyone else getting hurt." Jin's expression shifted to surprise, then something that might have been respect. "Negotiation from a position of strength," he said slowly, as if testing the concept. "It would be unexpected, which could work in our favor. But if they refuse reasonable terms, the response would need to be proportionally more severe." She nodded, understanding that her influence over his methods came with acceptance of the consequences when those methods failed. This was what it meant to be part of his world, making choices where every option carried the potential for violence and loss. The call to Kim's organization was arranged for late afternoon, with Kong handling the initial contact and terms. While they waited, Mia found herself pacing the small living room, nervous energy making it impossible to sit still as she thought about Sarah trapped somewhere because of choices that had seemed inevitable at the time. Jean watched her restless movement with growing concern, finally catching her hand as she passed his chair and pulling her gently toward him. "She's going to be safe," he said, his voice carrying quiet conviction. "Whatever it takes, we'll bring her home." The sincerity in his voice, combined with the solid warmth of his presence, broke through the last of Mia's emotional defenses. She found herself settling onto the arm of his chair, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his powerful frame. "How do you do it?" she asked softly. "How do you carry the weight of knowing that people might die because of decisions you make?" "By remembering that more people will die if I don't make those decisions," he replied, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with surprising gentleness. "By accepting that leadership means being willing to bear consequences that others shouldn't have to carry." The touch of his fingers against her skin sent electricity through her entire system, and she found herself leaning into the contact despite every rational thought that warned her against deepening their connection. This was insane, falling for someone whose life included kidnapping and territorial wars. But the man touching her with such careful tenderness bore no resemblance to the cold criminal she had imagined before meeting him. When she looked into his eyes, she saw not ruthless ambition but bone-deep loneliness and the constant burden of responsibility for lives he valued more than his own comfort. This was a man who cooked breakfast with loving attention to tradition, who protected people at personal cost, who treated her growing feelings as precious rather than convenient. "Jean," she whispered, not sure what she intended to say, but needing to acknowledge the connection building between them. He seemed to understand without words, his thumb stroking gently across her cheekbone as his dark eyes searched her face with an intensity that made her forget to breathe. When he leaned closer, she met him halfway, their lips coming together in a kiss that was both tender and desperate, full of longing that had been building since their first meeting. The kiss deepened naturally, her hands finding their way into his perfectly styled hair while his arms pulled her closer against his chest. She could taste coffee on his lips, could feel the controlled strength in his embrace, could sense the careful restraint that marked him as someone who understood the value of patience and proper timing. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Jean rested his forehead against hers with an expression of wonder mixed with something that looked like fear. "This complicates everything," he said quietly, though his arms remained around her as if he couldn't bear to let her go. "Good," she replied, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "I'm tired of simple. Simple never brought me anything worth keeping." Before he could respond, his phone rang with the harsh insistence that meant urgent business. Kang's voice carried news that made Jin's expression harden once again, and Mia watched the tender man disappear behind the mask of leadership that circumstances demanded. "They've refused our terms," Jean said after ending the call. "They want you delivered to them within 6 hours, or your coworker dies. They're treating this as an opportunity to demonstrate power rather than resolve conflict." The words hit Mia like physical blows, washing away the warmth of their intimate moment and replacing it with cold reality. The negotiation had failed, which meant Jean would now resort to the violent solutions he had hoped to avoid. "What happens now?" she asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Now we remind them why attacking our people was a mistake," Jean replied, his voice carrying the deadly certainty that made other men step aside when he walked into a room. "But first, I need you to promise me something." "Anything," she said without hesitation. "When this is over, when the immediate danger passes, I want you to really consider whether this life is something you can accept permanently." Jin's dark eyes held hers with painful honesty. "Because after tonight, there will be no pretending that my world is anything other than exactly what it appears to be." As Jean left to coordinate the rescue operation that would likely involve multiple deaths, Mia found herself alone with the terrifying realization that she was falling in love with a man who might not survive the violence required to keep her safe. The blue eyes that had always marked her as different were now the reason someone she cared about was preparing to risk everything, and she wasn't sure whether that made her precious or cursed. The warehouse district in the early evening felt like stepping into a different soul, all concrete shadows and industrial silence that provided the perfect backdrop for business that required discretion. Mia sat in the back seat of Jin's armored sedan, watching him review tactical plans with Kong and 3 other men whose faces carried the hard competence of professional soldiers. She wasn't supposed to be here. Jean had intended to leave her at the safe house with additional security while he handled the rescue operation, but Mia had refused to hide, while someone she cared about risked his life to save her coworker. The argument that followed had been brief but intense, ending when she pointed out that her marketing background might provide insights into Kim's psychology that pure force could not. "You understand this isn't a boardroom negotiation," Jean had said, his dark eyes holding hers with painful intensity. "People will likely die tonight, and once that violence begins, I won't be able to protect you from seeing things that can't be unseen." "I understand," she had replied, surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. "But I also understand that Sarah is trapped because of me. and I won't let other people pay the price for my choices while I sit safely somewhere else. Now, watching Jean transform from the tender man who had kissed her that morning into the cold tactician his organization needed him to be, Mia felt the full weight of what loving him would mean. This wasn't romance novel danger, but the real possibility of losing someone who had become essential to her happiness before she had fully recognized how much he meant to her. The intelligence Kong had gathered painted a clear picture of Kim's setup. They were holding Sarah in a converted office space above a legitimate import business, with approximately 8 armed men providing security. The location suggested they intended this as a demonstration of power rather than a simple exchange, which meant they were prepared for Jin's organization to respond with overwhelming force. "They're expecting us to come in shooting," Jean said as he studied building schematics on his tablet. Traditional rescue approach would be front and rear assault, eliminate resistance, extract the hostage. But they've positioned themselves to make that costly for everyone involved. Mia leaned forward, studying the building layout with eyes trained to see marketing opportunities rather than tactical advantages. "What if we approach this like a campaign instead of a battle?" she said slowly. "Make them want to give us what we want instead of forcing them to surrender it." The men around her exchanged skeptical glances, but Jin's expression shifted to the focused attention he gave ideas worth considering. "Explain," he said. "Kim's organization grabbed Sarah to demonstrate that they can hurt you through people you care about," Mia continued, her mind working through the psychological elements as if planning a product launch. "But they also want to emerge from this conflict with their reputation intact. Give them a way to save face while getting what they actually need, and they might choose that path over mutually destructive violence." "What do they actually need?" Kong asked, his tone respectful despite obvious doubts about her amateur assessment. "Recognition that they're a force worth respecting, not just criminals to be dismissed. They want other organizations to see that crossing them carries consequences, but they also need to avoid a war that could destroy their business operations." Jean was quiet for several minutes, his strategic mind clearly working through implications and possibilities. Then his expression shifted to something that looked like admiration mixed with concern. "You're suggesting we give them an honorable way to retreat, while making it clear that escalation would be catastrophic for them," he said. "It could work, but it would require perfect timing and complete commitment to follow through if they refuse." The plan they developed was complex, requiring coordination between multiple teams and careful attention to cultural nuances that could mean the difference between success and bloodshed. Mia's role was to remain with Jean during the initial approach, using her understanding of corporate psychology to help read Kim's responses and adjust tactics in real time. As they approached the building, Jin's hand found hers with gentle pressure. "Last chance to reconsider," he said quietly. "Once we walk in there, everything changes permanently." She squeezed his fingers, drawing strength from the solid warmth of his presence. "I chose this path when I chose you," she replied. "Whatever happens tonight, we face it together." The meeting took place in the building's ground floor office, neutral territory that allowed both sides to maintain dignity while negotiating terms. Kim's representative was an older man with intelligent eyes and expensive clothes, clearly someone with authority to make binding agreements on behalf of his organization. Jean spoke in formal Korean, his tone carrying respect without subservience as he outlined a proposal that acknowledged Kim's legitimate grievances while making clear the consequences of continued escalation. The woman's safety was non-negotiable, but other territorial disputes could be resolved through traditional methods that honored both organizations' interests. Mia watched the older man's face carefully, noting the subtle shifts in expression that suggested internal calculation. He was weighing options, considering whether the face-saving exit Jean was offering provided better long-term outcomes than the immediate satisfaction of demonstrating dominance through violence. The negotiation continued for nearly an hour, with both sides probing for weakness while maintaining the careful courtesy that kept civilized discussion from deteriorating into threats. Finally, Kim's representative nodded slowly and spoke a few words that made Jin's shoulders relax fractionally. "Your co-worker will be released within the hour," Jean told Mia quietly. "In exchange, we provide certain considerations regarding shipping routes that have been in dispute, and both sides agree to resolve future conflicts through established mediation rather than direct action." Relief flooded through Mia's system so powerfully that her knees went weak. Sarah would be safe, and the resolution had been achieved without the bloodshed that seemed inevitable just hours earlier. But as they prepared to leave the building, she noticed movement in the shadows that suggested not everyone involved was committed to the peaceful solution their leaders had negotiated. Jean must have seen the same movement, because his hand was already reaching for his concealed weapon when the first gunshot shattered the careful diplomacy of the previous hour. Someone in Kim's organization had decided to take matters into their own hands, and the tactical situation deteriorated into chaos within seconds. "Get down," Jean commanded, pushing Mia behind a heavy desk as bullets began flying across the office space. The older man they had been negotiating with was shouting orders in angry Korean, clearly as surprised by this development as Jin's people. But his authority over his subordinates had evidently been compromised by someone who preferred violence to negotiation. The firefight was brief but intense, with Jin's superior training and preparation giving his team decisive advantages over Kim's poorly coordinated ambush. But in the final moments, as the last shooter made a desperate attempt to reach Mia's position, Jean threw himself between them with the instinctive protectiveness that defined his entire character. The bullet that would have struck her center mass caught him high in the shoulder instead, spinning him around with the force of impact before he collapsed against the wall with blood spreading rapidly across his pristine white shirt. Mia's scream of his name seemed to echo in the sudden silence as Kang's men finished securing the scene and eliminating the remaining threats. Jean tried to wave away her concern even as she pressed her hands desperately against his wound, his face pale, but his dark eyes still focused on her safety rather than his own pain. "It's not that bad," he insisted, though the blood seeping between her fingers suggested otherwise. "Don't talk," she commanded, her voice steadier than she felt as she applied pressure to slow the bleeding. "Kong, we need medical attention immediately." The drive to Jin's private doctor felt like the longest journey of her life, with Mia maintaining pressure on his wound while monitoring his consciousness and vital signs with the desperate attention of someone whose world had just been reduced to keeping one person alive. Jin's hand remained clasped in hers throughout the trip, his grip weakening but persistent as he fought to stay present with her. At the discreet medical facility, she waited in an agony of uncertainty while Jean underwent surgery to remove the bullet and repair the damage to his shoulder. Kong brought word that Sarah had been released unharmed and was already being debriefed by his people, but Mia could barely process the information through her focus on the man whose life was being decided behind closed doors. When the doctor finally emerged with news that Jean would recover completely, Mia felt something break open in her chest. Relief so powerful it left her shaking as she realized how close she had come to losing someone who had become essential to her existence. She was sitting beside his bed when Jean woke, his dark eyes immediately seeking hers with the automatic reflex of someone whose first priority was always the safety of those he protected. "How do you feel?" she asked softly, her hand finding his uninjured one with gentle pressure. "Like I've been shot," he replied with a weak smile that transformed his entire face. "But significantly better knowing you're safe." "Jean," she said, her voice carrying all the emotion that had been building since the moment she saw him bleeding. "I love you. I love your strength and your gentleness, your honor and your willingness to sacrifice everything for people you care about. I love the way you see my differences as precious rather than problematic. I don't care about the danger or the complications or anything else, because I know that whatever life we build together will be worth every risk." His expression shifted to wonder mixed with something that might have been relief, as if he had been holding his breath waiting for her to fully understand what choosing him would mean. "I've loved you since that first night," he said quietly, his thumb stroking across her knuckles with tender reverence. "You walked into my world and made it brighter, made me remember that honor isn't just about duty, but about protecting what's truly precious. You've changed how I think, how I solve problems, how I see the future I want to build." They remained like that for several minutes, hands clasped and eyes locked, acknowledging the depth of connection that had developed between them despite every rational argument against it. When Jean spoke again, his voice carried formal certainty that made her breath catch. "Marry me," he said simply. "Not because the situation demands it or because it's convenient, but because I can't imagine a future that doesn't include waking up beside you every morning. Because your blue eyes are the most beautiful thing I've ever seen, and I want the right to tell you that every day for the rest of our lives." The proposal was so quintessentially Jean, direct and honest without flowery speeches or elaborate gestures, an offer of partnership based on mutual respect and genuine devotion rather than romantic fantasy. It was perfect for the man who had saved her life and stolen her heart in equal measure. "Yes," she said, leaning down to kiss him gently, careful of his injured shoulder. "Yes to marriage. Yes to building something new together. Yes to all of it." Later, as Jean recovered and their engagement became known throughout both organizations, Mia learned that their union was being viewed as a strategic alliance that strengthened both sides while demonstrating the power of honor over pure aggression. The woman with blue eyes who had once felt like an outsider in every world she entered had somehow become the bridge that connected different cultures and different approaches to loyalty and protection. Kim's organization had formally apologized for the unauthorized violence and provided compensation that satisfied traditional requirements for honor while ensuring future conflicts would be handled through proper channels. Sarah had been safely returned with no lasting harm beyond a frightening experience that left her with new appreciation for Mia's strength and judgment. As Jean healed and their wedding planning began, incorporating elements of both Korean tradition and acknowledgement of Mia's mixed heritage, she realized that her blue eyes had indeed become a kind of lucky charm, not because they predicted fortune, but because they had helped her recognize when she found something precious enough to fight for, regardless of the cost. 6 months later, Seoul's autumn sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Jin's legitimate business offices, where Mia Chin-woo sat reviewing marketing proposals for their expanding import company. The nameplate on her desk read Director of International Relations, a title that accurately described both her professional role and her personal position as the bridge between Jin's traditional Korean organization and the modern global marketplace they were working to enter. The transition from advertising executive to crime boss's wife and business partner had been smoother than anyone expected, including Mia herself. Jin's people had welcomed her not just as their leader's choice, but as someone who brought valuable skills and perspectives to their operations. Her ability to navigate both Korean and American business cultures made her invaluable for the legitimate enterprises that provided cover and income for the organization's activities. She was reviewing contracts for a new shipping partnership when Jean appeared in her doorway, impeccably dressed as always, but with the relaxed confidence of a man who no longer carried the weight of immediate threats to those he loved. The shoulder injury from 6 months ago had healed completely, leaving only a small scar that she sometimes traced with gentle fingers during their quiet moments together. "Are you ready for lunch with my mother?" he asked, his tone carrying the subtle nervousness that always appeared when discussing his mother's opinions about their relationship. "Ready as I'll ever be," Mia replied, saving her work and gathering her jacket. "Your mother is formidable, but I think she's starting to approve of me." The restaurant Jin's mother had chosen was traditional Korean, elegant, but not ostentatious, the kind of place where serious family business was conducted over carefully prepared meals. Mrs. Jin Seyoung was already seated when they arrived, her silver hair styled impeccably and her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Mia's appearance and demeanor with the assessment of someone accustomed to judging character quickly and accurately. The conversation flowed in mixture of Korean and English, with Jin's mother asking detailed questions about the wedding preparations and expressing particular interest in how they planned to honor both cultural traditions. Mia had worried that her mixed heritage would create complications, but Mrs. Jean seemed to view their union as an opportunity to demonstrate the strength that came from blending different strengths rather than insisting on rigid tradition. "Your blue eyes will bring good fortune to our family," Mrs. Jean said toward the end of their meal, reaching across to pat Mia's hand with surprising warmth. "In Korea, we believe that unusual beauty carries special blessings. Your children will be beautiful and strong, connecting old wisdom with new possibilities." The mention of children made both Mia and Jean exchange glances loaded with meaning, though neither was quite ready to share the news they had only confirmed that morning. The pregnancy test had been positive, revealing that their future was already beginning to take shape in ways more immediate than they had planned. Later that evening, in the penthouse that had become their shared home, Mia found herself standing before the same windows where she had first glimpsed the complexity of Jin's world. Now those windows looked out on a city where she belonged completely, where her mixed heritage was seen as an asset rather than a complication, where her blue eyes marked her not as foreign but as precious. Jin joined her at the windows, his arms encircling her from behind as they watched Seoul's lights begin to twinkle in the gathering darkness. The city spread below them no longer felt intimidating, but full of possibilities they would explore together. "I have something to tell you," she said, leaning back against his solid warmth while trying to find the right words for news that would change everything once again. He turned her gently in his arms, dark eyes searching her face with the attention that made her feel completely seen and understood. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together," he said with quiet conviction. "We're going to have a baby," she said simply, watching his expression transform through surprise to wonder to joy so complete it made her breath catch. For several moments, he simply held her, his face buried in her hair as he processed the magnitude of what she had told him. When he pulled back to look at her again, his eyes held tears of happiness that made her own eyes well up in response. "A baby with your beautiful eyes," he said softly, his hands moving to rest gently on her still flat stomach. "Our parents will be so proud, and the organization will celebrate having a new generation to protect and guide." The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a ceremony that blended Korean tradition with acknowledgement of Mia's Irish-American heritage, creating something new that honored both families while establishing their own unique identity. Mia wore traditional hanbok for the Korean ceremony and an elegant white gown for the American-style reception, her blue eyes bright with happiness as she promised to love and protect the man who had rescued her from danger and given her a place to belong completely. Jin's organization turned out in formal dress, respectful and celebratory as they witnessed their leader's marriage to the woman who had brought both strength and compassion to their traditional ways. Mia's family, initially nervous about their daughter marrying into a world they didn't understand, were won over by Jin's obvious devotion and the genuine warmth of his people's acceptance. The months that followed brought changes that rippled through both their personal lives and their professional world. Mia's pregnancy progressed smoothly, with Jin becoming increasingly protective and attentive as their daughter's birth approached. The legitimate businesses flourished under their combined leadership, with Mia's marketing expertise opening doors to international partnerships that had previously been impossible. The baby was born on a clear spring morning when Seoul's cherry blossoms were in full bloom, a perfect little girl with her mother's distinctive blue eyes and her father's strong features. They named her Sujin, honoring Jin's mother while choosing a name that worked beautifully in both Korean and English pronunciation. As Mia held their daughter for the first time, she marveled at how completely her life had transformed from the lonely corporate executive who had worked late in empty offices to the cherished wife and mother who belonged at the center of a large, protective family. The blue eyes that had once marked her as different were now the family's lucky charm, a sign of beauty and strength that would be passed to future generations. Jin's mother was among the first to visit the hospital, bringing traditional gifts and speaking softly to her granddaughter in Korean while tears of joy streamed down her face. When she looked up at Mia, her expression held complete acceptance and genuine love. "She will be even more beautiful than her mother," Mrs. Jin said, gently stroking the baby's soft cheek. "And she will know exactly where she belongs, because her parents created a place for her that honors all her heritage." 6 months after Sujin's birth, as Mia sat in the nursery feeding her daughter while Jean read business reports nearby, she reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect contentment. The woman who had once felt caught between worlds had found a way to create a new world that embraced all the pieces of her identity. Her daughter would grow up knowing that being different was a source of strength rather than something to overcome. That family was defined by love and loyalty rather than just genetics. That true belonging came from being valued for exactly who you were rather than trying to fit into spaces that were never quite the right shape. If you're watching this and you've ever felt like you didn't quite belong anywhere, like you were caught between cultures or identities, I want you to know that sometimes the most beautiful futures come from embracing those differences rather than trying to smooth them away. Love has a way of creating space for all the pieces of who you are, even the ones that don't seem to fit anywhere else. Have you found your place where being different makes you precious rather than problematic? Share your story in the comments, because there's something powerful about knowing we're not alone in building lives that honor all the parts of ourselves. As souls settled into evening quiet around them, Mia watched Jean gently take their sleeping daughter from her arms, his strong hands infinitely tender as he placed Jean in her crib. The three of them were a family now, rooted in love that had grown from the most unlikely circumstances into something strong enough to bridge any gap. The girl with blue eyes who had once been laughed at for being different was now the mother of the next generation. The woman whose unusual beauty had become the symbol of luck and blessing for an entire organization. Her eyes, once a mark of not quite belonging, were now the most treasured feature in a family that saw them as a gift from fate itself. In the peaceful darkness of their daughter's nursery, surrounded by the life they had built together against all odds, Mia finally understood what it meant to belong completely somewhere, with someone who saw every part of her as exactly right.